Evening. I'm Ben Hull, and I really am grateful to Sebastian for setting up this opportunity to come and share with you all some insights on tactical war game design. Without further ado, I shall start off a little bit. Uh, just real quick, why me versus any other talking head on the internet? I've designed commercial tactical games for over the last 20 years. I play a lot of tactical games. It's kind of the things that what I enjoy doing when I'm not actually working. And then when I am working, I work for the Department of Defense, and I analyze the readiness of the total force at various levels, but I have a lot of insight at the tactical level. So I will keep all my commentary at the open source level here. So no worries about spilling anything across the internet. So here's just a few covers and P500 things that are out there. So the games I've done over the last 20 years. The Musket and Pike Dual Pack was fairly recent, last year that came out. That is a reprint. So This Accursed Civil War was the very first one I published way back when. So I've done a few since then. I felt like I've learned a few things that I'd like to share with you all this evening that hopefully you find helpful if you're interested in designing a tactical game of your own, or more insight into the games you play and why the decisions might be made the way they are. So very quickly, obviously in the name of the talk is tactical war game design, as just a quick primer on the levels of war as we understand them in kind of the U.S. Department of Defense is the terms that we look at it. We range from the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. So strategic war or conflict is deterring, fighting, and winning wars at a national or people group level. So I kind of list different things that come into play at that strategic level. Yeah, many people enjoy games at that level. Then right there in the middle is operational. So that's numbered armies, air forces, or fleets within a given theater, and they conduct campaigns. And campaigns would be a series of maneuvers, battles, or actions that accomplish strategic goals. And then what we're going to talk about tonight is tactical. That's the fighting of battles or engagements. So these are the individual engagements that collectively would make up parts of a campaign towards achieving strategic goals. And how they existed at different times in history uh, span between those levels pretty rapidly. Now, it is worthwhile. You may have heard, terms about grand tactical. It does span quite a distance, right? So for military purposes, we consider all of those tactical, but they have very different considerations for fairly obvious reasons. If I went down to the basic military individual skill level up to a regiment or even a division size unit, uh, much bigger, different things to worry about. So the problems we have at the tactical level of war, which I kind of alluded to, is we are resolving interactions, be it combat, maneuver, these types of things that happen in an engagement. But we have games that are out there that model individual people all the way to divisions of and it could cover the scope of, like, so my historical battle games might have 70, 80,000 soldiers on any given side. So you've got a battle over a 1 or 2 day period with 150,000 people fighting over an area 5, 10 miles across. Or it could be a game of two players fighting over a single room in a single house in a building. So with that comes enormous amount of variation. Now when we game, we think of turns, rounds, or impulses, segments, so we can organize and interact with the game. So one of the challenges we have at the tactical level is it could be seconds all the way to days. If you get into weeks and months, you're probably getting closer to the operational level. But that is quite a range of time segments. And with that becomes a lot of time trade-offs and design things that we have to take into account when we're looking at these tactical interactions. But we've been doing this for a while commercially uh, and also professionally in the military side. And the two have run fairly parallel. And so it creates this wide world of options. It's kind of winnowed down to a set of design patterns that are familiar to a lot of players. When you say, oh, I play this style or this style or this style of game, and there may be a lot of variation within that given pattern or style, but it does give a level of familiarity with it. If you want to talk about airplanes, we got dogfight games. There's a ton of different styles of dogfight games, but they kind of coalesce around that concept of I've got two or more aircraft doing a dogfight or fighting each other directly. I may have a ship game. I have ships that exist at fleet action level or individual ships. I may have a set of land warfare games that are dealing at the regiment, battalion, division level, or I may have set that works at the squad level. So we have these sets, but that's just how we kind of communicate and get people to learn the games more easily. So if I'm going to design a game, I'm going to start with the learning objective. So when we talk about war games, we're looking across a kind of a basic spectrum of why we do the war games. Now, on the professional side of wargaming, there is what we call an analytical war game. It is a war game that generates a data set, then that data set is analyzed for further purposes. So I may do like a super complex physics-based model and use a war game and to generate a data set that we analyze how much munitions did we use in that war game as a way to figure out, well, what should the Department of Defense buy as munitions? So those are analytical war games. We use those for a lot of different purposes on the professional wargaming side. On the commercial side, not so much. Now, some of the more complex side of the games will feel like an analytical war game, and they borrow from that arena a little bit because there is a demand signal out there for some players to play really complex games. And I've met a lot of players over the years who like to take records and keep track, kind of the meta game of the game. It's like baseball. Baseball isn't about necessarily that 9 innings right there. People take stats over the season. Some people like to play games and keep stats because it just makes them feel good. Now, on the other side, the commercial side, there's some games we just do for straight up entertainment. There's a little bit more, at least in my opinion, when we go into war games because, yes, the game might be generally entertaining, but it's also kind of providing something besides, tiddlywinks or, craps or any other just game that one could play for entertainment. It provides some sort of kind of wrapping to it that says, oh, well, this has military themed, it has military interactions, etc. So it also brings with it either a training or education piece to it. Now, on the professional side, we use war games to train military people to do things. So I could use a war game as a training tool to train people. So to differentiate between training and education, I train people to do things like a task, call for fire, write an order, do a intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Certain tasks that they do that have enumerated steps, and the war game can fuel the situation for that training task. So it can provide the input or the context for them to perform a training task to standard. The more broad thing on education is we're teaching something about the model, what we're showing in the game, or we're teaching something about the conflict, or a little bit of both. So that is kind of more where we see the commercial war game space is there's an enjoyment of a game, the intellectual challenge with the military theme, but oftentimes we layer into that a piece of education to provide some sort of insight or education about that particular battle, war, conflict, etc. So uh, being clear what you want to communicate through the game is going to help you kind of shape the rest. So as we move past kind of this learning objectives, and that's, since I tend to add a educational component, I think of it in terms of learning objectives. What is it I'm trying to communicate or teach to the game player? So the audience then is the next piece. And this is a challenge in the commercial space because it's an uncontrolled environment. Somebody can just see it online or see it in a store and buy it. So making too many assumptions about the player can be frustrating. In a professional or an educational context where you're bringing a game to a known audience, you can tailor it very much to that audience. So a little bit different considerations, but a lot of times the games are, on the commercial side are fairly esoteric or specific to a particular conflict. And so they don't get a huge amount of just general traffic. So if I do a game on the War of the Spanish Succession, there's a lot of people who have no idea what that is. And a lot of people are going to be reluctant to plunk down, 50, $60 on a game, even if it looks cool, that on a conflict they've never heard of or know very little about. So it is going to kind of attract a niche players. So it depends on the style of game. So if I do like a World War II tactical game, a lot of people are interested in, you're going to get a much broader response. Something very historical or very niche, you're going to get a much smaller response. And therefore you can kind of treat the player a little bit differently because they're going to bring to it with some knowledge. And if not, you can fill that gap with the materials in the game. But the main things is the prior experience. So if I'm writing for a military audience, I can bring forward, some of that military, I guess, I hate to say jargon because it's more to it than that, but, kind of that professional military education. And you can speak in terms that they're familiar with. The different age groups, etc. Who are you aiming at, and then the general subject knowledge, right? So if it's a historical game, people that come to it with a general knowledge. There's a lot more general knowledge about World War II or Napoleon or the American Civil War than there is about the 30 Years' War. Now, then we start getting into real serious design trade-offs that you got to really consider if you're building out the game. So the time window is one of the critical pieces because the time is going to drive a lot of the trade-offs you have to make in layers of abstraction, right? I can model a lot of different things, but if that model takes too long, then the game is too hard to play in the time window that it's targeting. So then that drives your trade-offs. If I've got so much time to do it in, you've got to kind of analyze how much time does it take to do all the activities you want the player to do in a reasonable knowledge. They don't become experts at playing the game overnight. So there's a little bit of a learning curve. So you can kind of figure some of that in there, but they have to start somewhere. And so if you're looking at something that's going to be set up for over 4 hours to play, it's probably going to have to be played over more than one session. So it'd have to be left set up, etc. So you got to keep those things in the back of your mind. Now, when you're planning for these things, it's very difficult to do something in less than an hour that has any kind of depth to it, unless it's very small, like a mini game. You can have a relatively complex mini game with deep interactions, but it takes very, very little time to set up. And because the scale of a mini game, just the number of hexes or pieces that you're playing with is pretty small, you can get closer to a small amount of time. You can also hit at small windows with using familiar game mechanics. So like how to adapt a well-known game like Go Fish or War or some classic card games, how to adapt basic mechanics from those games to help illustrate this military theme that you're trying to do. That's a way to hit a small window, but typically the tactical games that I design or I work with are hitting that little bit 4 to 5 hour window. So sometimes they're set up overnight or to a next session. So, but keep that in mind. If now in an educational format, if you got a class you're hitting, you know how long you got in class and whether or not you can leave it set up. There's a couple tricks that you can do when you're facilitating a game to save some time on setup if you have time before a class or a session to set it up. But generally, if that's not designed specifically for that environment, that can be tough, especially games with complex setups. There's a lot of things you can do in the design and presentation to lower some of that overhead or burden, which is much appreciated if you have that in your budget to do. Now, the next one is almost as difficult to manage as the time window is the physical space that you have available to the player. All right, so I put some measurements in here so you get some ideas in inches. If you're in a metric country, it's, you can do the math, it's not hard. But a standard card table is that you, if you went to Walmart, Target, whatever, they're all pretty much the same. The folding leg card table is 34 by 34 inches. Just so happens that a standard map sheet is 34 by 22 inches. And that's 4 11 by 17 sheets for those who are wondering how that works. And so that it just barely fits. And then you have a little buffer on either side of the map. So keep that in mind if you have a map sheet and a player aid card or something that they have to put pieces on, that's going to take up more space. So the physical footprint matters. There's a lot of players out there who don't have a dining room to leave a game set up in on a large table. So it can reduce the size of the audience or participants. So I also kind of said there are much smaller things. So the advanced squad leader, the geomorphic map sheets they use are 8 inches by 22 inches, and they often use half of that for a scenario. So it'll be 8 by 11, which is basically almost just slightly smaller than a standard sheet of paper. So you can make them pretty small. Getting a map or something usable under 8.5 by 11 is challenging, but it is possible. Now, the next huge subject before you go in there is this concept of domains. So we use the term in the Department of Defense to describe these physical environments and then these special environments. So I'm going to walk through them. The land domain is obviously probably the oldest, most well-known domain that we fight over, right? We fight over land. And so it's very popular in game coverage, and there's literally a countless number of games that cover land conflict. So kind of goes without saying now that it is the basis of all warfare, because we don't really live on the oceans and we don't really live in the air, but we ultimately live on land. Therefore, that's where we have to fight for it. Now, the Maritime is next oldest area where we fight, and so it brings with it some specialty. So the age of sail and those types of before modern naval warfare, a lot of popular games about that. But it suddenly gets more complex than land because the ocean is moving, ships are moving, everything's moving. And you have to worry about wind and weather and a lot more conditions right off the bat. And that's even in the age of sail. The ocean is moving, there's a current, there's wind, there's the weather vane, all these things that go with maritime warfare that are just a whole step more complicated than just standing on a piece of ground. Okay, so now if we want to do something more modern, it's very difficult to do anything of any detail in modern maritime warfare without involving the air domain. We kind of figured that out before World War II, that naval aviation and is going to be incredibly important. And if you substitute missiles in there in this current age, so much of naval warfare involves the air domain concurrently. Now, there's some subsurface stuff that you can do that is kind of standalone, right? You can do the whole subsurface warfare thing, but if you're actually going to do the anti-submarine warfare, the naval aviation is very critical component of anti-submarine warfare. So once again, if you get beside just a submarine hunting a ship in an older technology, it's going to involve the air domain. And that suddenly creates a problem that I'll kind of tease out a problem a little bit more when we get into an example of the challenges that we have in maritime domain. Now, the air domain is an interesting one because it's relatively new in the grand scheme of things. So, as I mentioned earlier, dogfighting, incredibly popular genre or design pattern for a tactical game. Now, does that represent what's normative in air warfare? And the answer is absolutely not. No, it turns out that if you actually analyze air-to-air warfare, most of the poor schmoes that got shot down had no idea, right? So they were just flying along. Turns out flying the airplane is hard and complicated anyway. And so most of the poor guys that get shot down are busy just aviating. And it's just a few of them sneak up and shoot you in the back. So every once in a while you do have a dogfight, but it's like under 20% of aerial victories were in a dogfight situation. And it gets even less when we get in the age of missiles. So what is a representative tactical game approach to air warfare? And that's is not as represented as well as dogfighting, but I'd say there are raid level games where you design and fight out an air raid and all the different types of aircraft and planning and actions that go with that. That's a much more representative tactical view of how air warfare actually works. But it comes with some challenges. It is a good bit more complex than just flying two airplanes at two other airplanes. So, you know, when we get into questions, I've got examples because I've played just games about every one of these because at different eras, hugely interested in air warfare, hugely interested in maritime warfare as well as land warfare. So, done a lot of things with all those different domains. Now I'm going to get into some of the newer domains that were added to the list that aren't really gamed well or at all in some cases. So space, okay, it's a critical domain for warfighting in the modern era, but it's much more complicated than just even air domain. So if you look at space warfare at an open source arena, we're mostly talking about satellites. You might have some other space vehicles, but 99.9% of your things in space are satellites. And to do anything with a satellite, you have six the classic components of orbital mechanics. So there's six pieces of telemetry to understand where a satellite is. So it's a three-dimensional problem. But if you think of the three-dimensional problem of an air simulation, and it's I'm worried about multiple dimensions, 3 dimensions there. I've got 6 dimensions that I have to worry about on where the term they use is an anomaly. The anomaly is where they think the satellite is, because it turns out we don't really know exactly where it is. It's moving really fast. But if you have those 6 pieces of telemetry, you can have a pretty good idea where the anomaly is in space. And then how to maneuver or fight with that is insanely complicated, but it's also incredibly important in modern warfare to control space. And so it's a deep subject, should be gamed, but most everything that I know about that games it at that level is top secret. So the physics is not. The classical elements of orbital mechanics are open source, well-known, just physics. Cyber domain. We actually added that to the list of domains. Cyberspace is considered a warfighting domain. So it's an interesting subject. I did a lot of my career developing software, doing analysis, working with computers. I've set up websites. I did a lot of stuff with the internet back in the bad old days, and before we had cybersecurity, and then implementing these things over the years. It is an important subject because we do a lot with TCP/IP, the network protocol that runs everything. That's why we're talking on this screen. how do we fight in that domain and and its implications down the line. And so any one of these domains is, you've heard the term air superiority. So this is that it describes the relationship of forces in a given domain. So I have in land, you can have, you have superiority, and then you have supremacy, right? I want to gain superiority so I can maneuver where I want to maneuver. And then if I have supremacy, I can maneuver where I want to maneuver and not lose my forces, right? So I can preserve enough of my forces to kind of do whatever I want. So that concept applies to each domain. I can have cyber parity, I can have cyber superiority, local superiority, total superiority, cyber supremacy. If you kind of apply that analogy, it works in every domain. Then we have this weird one. That's why it's kind of a blended color there below cyber is the electromagnetic spectrum. We don't consider that a domain because it is pervasive across all domains in the physicality of it. But within warfare in the electromagnetic spectrum, we consider that like a domain, but it is pervasive across. And so it is rarely gamed explicitly, but it is also a very important piece of modern warfare. If you think about, we think a lot about like, wow, my radar and my IR and all these different things. These are all part of electromagnetics. My ability to communicate with radio frequency RF. All those are electromagnetic spectrum events that can be contested. So very important in the modern era. And then I can contest those either in my physical domains or through cyber. So all these things interrelate in some ways. And that's one of the challenges of modern warfare. So and then that's why I put the bottom multiple domain warfare. That's how do I use and fight across the domains to generate decisive effects in the domain of choice, right? So if I want to dominate the land, I'm going to have to do these other things in the other domains so that I can dominate the land. And I've got to do that and time it. So the synchronization of that is really critical in warfighting. And so when we see like the Russians underperform in Ukraine, it's because they did not synchronize well across multiple domains to get the desired effect on the land domain or the air domain. And so then they have to do it the hard way. Doesn't mean you lose. It just means it's going to cost you to achieve what you want to do. And is that going to cost more than you're willing to pay? So scale. So we talked about domains, and each domain comes with it a scale problem. So when we're going to design a game, we're going to put this thing either on a computer screen or a tabletop. So I have to deal with what am I going to depict and show the player. It's got to exist in some kind of representation of physical space. So it's interrelated with domain. So land domain, depending on the level at which you're doing it, like a division or an individual, I may have a map sheet that's the same size, 34 by 22, but what it depicts may be 100 kilometers across or 2 kilometers across. So that's this idea of scale. And so, as I just alluded, the echelon depicted really drives a lot of that. Am I looking at individual airplanes, individual ships? Am I looking at battalions or rifle companies, etc.? And so you bring that echelon, and then it has certain distances, etc., that constrain its physical location. We know a division by doctrine covered so much frontage within a certain time era. So divisions cover more frontage now than they used to in World War II or World War I. But we know what those numbers are. So that kind of brings with it. If I'm going to have divisions, it's going to cover this much battle space by doctrine. That kind of drives that. And we know if I'm looking at a smaller level, we know the limitations of radar communicate or radio or radar, et cetera. So that kind of drives that area. And so the range of platforms and weapons, the missile shoots this far, small arms go this far. Now we know what those are, And so how that is depicted in the game, how these weapons or platforms interact. We know how fast they can move. So those things are just the math part of it once we kind of figured out the echelon. Now the available footprint I alluded to before, how do we fit that into the space that we've allocated for the simulation? Now part of this too is there's this need to maintain the illusion of movement, right? So games need to be have a level of movement to keep people interested, right? So if my piece only ever moves one little bit every time it comes around, that you get a illusion of non-movement, which is going to give you a negative response in a professional as well as a commercial arena. The player has to feel like they have agency or doing something. So when you're scaling this out on the map, I got to move so much to feel like I physically moved. Now, there's some tricks that you can do with different historical situations or what you're trying to model that provide an illusion of movement even when the physical movement is limited. So if I was going to fight, the Battle of Arnhem Bridge, right? This classic war game of storm over Arnhem was an area of movement. So this preserved this illusion of movement, even though the forces weren't physically moving very far. So that was kind of a innovative way at the time to show that. And then what all are you modeling? Are we modeling the ability to move and shoot? Are we modeling the ability to move out? What all models are you putting into the engine that you need to depict and put on a map or a computer screen? Now, keep in mind, too, when I say computer screen, even if I design a physical war game, there's a variety of ways to put it onto the computer screen because a lot of people have computers. They have tablets, they have computers, and there's a couple ways to put it on a screen. So keep that in the back of the mind. Oftentimes, the computer screen is not as satisfying. The human brain can actually look at a map, and you have a very powerful spatial optimizer on board. So your brain can look at the map, and it can zoom in and out automatically, almost at a level where you're not doing it consciously, but you can scan a full map sheet and come to a lot of conclusions very rapidly. That's somewhat more difficult to do on a computer screen because you have to manipulate the computer screen to zoom in and out that you don't have to do with your own eyes. Your eyes just do it automatically. So that's when a lot of people say, I don't like to play the computer games because I can't see the big picture. You're exactly right because you only see the picture that you're manipulating on the screen versus I just look on a map and I see it. No, but the reality is having something that can be put on a screen is handy because that is a way to get your product out to the consumers. So let's talk about scale and the maritime problem. So you do a little bit of math and you find out pretty quick in a modern maritime problem, you've got a couple of really difficult scale problems and how to present that in a game. So let's look at a surface action vessel, be it a frigate, a destroyer, cruiser, whatever you want to call it. Its speed can range from 15 to 30 knots, somewhere in between there. And then we know what the radar horizon is. The math is unclassified. You can go and you can look up the formula for calculating radar horizon. And so if I have a radar at 75 feet, there will be 12 miles at sea level. But I can see something at 200 miles if it's an aircraft, right? So, so you have the height of the two things matter. But yes, the Earth is round, and it's way more rounder than some people think. You see the ship disappear over the horizon. That did not fall off the edge of the Earth. So that's one thing. So we tend to look at ship speeds and things in nautical miles, which is about 1,854 meters if you're on the conversion. Good thing we have spreadsheets to do the math for us. So a typical anti-ship missile most of them out there are subsonic, and they're going to travel somewhere around 500 knots. It's moving pretty fast, but the speed of sound at sea level is 661 knots. And so they're traveling about that 500 knot plus or minus 50. Tactical aircraft tend to cruise at subsonic speeds because it's very fuel inefficient to go supersonic, and they tend to cruise at about 450 knots. So that gives you an idea that, wait, you're actually traveling 12 times as fast as a ship at flank speed. Yes. So that creates a scale problem. So say if I arbitrarily choose, hey, I've got a game where I've got a hex grid and I've got a ship as my maneuver unit, a single ship. And to make it convenient, for the sake of play test, let's make a turn about 5 minutes and the grid size 5 nautical miles across. So that way the ships are going to be pretty spread out, but they should be relatively close because there'll be a few nautical miles between ships if you had a surface action group. But they're not going to be quite as close as that ship is in the picture, maybe the one in the back. So if I have 5 minutes, in 5 minutes at 5 nautical miles, I'm at 15 knots, I'm only going to go 1 1/4 hexes. That's not a lot of movement. So that goes to the illusion of movement. Yeah, I got to move a couple, 3, 4, or 5 spaces to let the player feel like it's moving. Right? Otherwise, if you're creeping along, they get bored real fast. So at flank speed, you're going 2.5, 30 knots. That's not super a lot of movement. But keep in mind, an aircraft on that same grid is going to move 37.5 hexes. A missile will move 45.8. Now, a full map sheet, depending on the size of the hex, may only have about 45 hexes on the long axis of the map. So it literally can move all the way across the map inside the 5 minutes. Now, the rest of the story is the ship can't see the edge of the map. If it's sitting in the edge of the map or looking down the long axis of the map, it probably couldn't see that far. It can see a missile, an anti-ship missile isn't right at the sea level. It's up a few meters, so it doesn't crash. So you can see it on your own radar at about, for the sake of argument, 20 nautical miles. Okay, so if I know that thing is going 500 knots, it's going to cover that 20 nautical miles. It goes, in just over 2 minutes. So the ship has 2 minutes to detect, identify, and then engage that incoming missile. So that's a lot that can happen in that 2-minute window. So if I picked an arbitrary 5-minute turn, well, that missile can come in there, and then I have to resolve that entire interaction within the space of a single turn. So is that what you're looking for? Should you change the scale? Where's the shooter? Where's the missile? How does that work? Right. So it ends up being a lot of interesting math problems. And then one of the challenges we have in the maritime domain is you see the space that aviation can cover or a missile can cover, and the ship's moving along. And then if you add in a subsurface component to that, if you're familiar with anti-submarine warfare, it's about as fun as watching grass grow. So the term they use is prosecuting an undersea contact. So that's what like a destroyer uses. That you use that term. We're prosecuting the contact, which is a fairly sanitary way of saying we're hunting a submarine. That takes hours of work. It is not something you go, ooh, I think a sub's there. Boop, got him, sink him. It's not quite as exciting as like Greyhound, right? The movie's like, oh, here's one here, here's one here. Well, yeah, that 2-hour movie was really like 18 hours of fighting. So there's different clocks moving. So if ships are moving on one clock, submarines and that ability to find and hide and then hide and seek is another clock. And then you got a really fast clock turning on aviation, be it missile or an aircraft or both. So that is a very difficult simulation problem to do on and not overwhelm the player with lot. Computers are great at that, so that's why there's some computer games that do that relatively well. But even then, there's a trade-off. So, like if you do Command PE, it does the surface and air stuff pretty cool, but because you can't sit there for 18 hours to find a submarine. It moves along the subsurface stuff a little bit quicker than it really happens in real life. But the air stuff is pretty well represented in the pace of it. Obviously, the realities of it are highly classified on the exact range and how that interaction works. But the command off the shelf one isn't a bad simulation. It's a pretty good. It's all based on the Janes data, which is pretty good open source data. So serious scale problems dealing with modern maritime warfare. And I see this one is very difficult to do well. So Harpoon usually kind of cornered that market for the tabletop market. It didn't use a hex grid at first. It was just using a ship marker and rulers to do it. And you often ended up having to truncate pieces of the interaction. So you miss the real understanding of the naval warfare. Now, I'll get into some other problems that comes in too, because I think one of the challenges here is we can focus on like the speeds and the scale and the platform interaction and miss the human interaction factor, was absolutely critical. And so it's kind of what I'm hinting at. In that 2 minutes, the ship has a lot to do. And if the crew isn't trained, the crew proficiency, crew fatigue, all these things make that a much more difficult problem in naval warfare that often is underrepresented. All right. So another scale problem, let's move to land. So I got a modern guy up here. I got some Soviet descent jumping off a T-34. The land problem has its own set of issues as we move into the modern era. So the modern battlefield is highly dispersed. So we move from not even that long ago. We moved from the 19th century where we have dense infantry formations. We're moving en masse to overwhelm an objective, to this widely dispersed battlefield, and that happens because of the rapid increase of the lethality of direct fire and indirect fire weapons. We had to widely disperse the battlefield, or everybody get killed right off the bat. So people take cover, they crawl, they use fire and movement, so they spread out over a much larger area. That's why, like when we talk about like the frontage that I mentioned earlier for a division is much larger now than it was then, because we're much more dispersed to reduce our vulnerability to the highly lethal modern weapons. And then we have some inherent speed problems, right? So I can walk, but I don't walk very fast. But that's what infantry does. That's what I did when I was an infantryman. I walked a lot. But a tank or a Bradley or LAV or any of these mechanized armored vehicles, a Humvee, they all go much faster than I can walk. So there is a whole, and even if I go back in history, you had horses. So guys on horses could actually go a lot faster on the battlefield than guys could at the speed of walking. And then they walk even slower because they're having to be in these large formations. So everybody had to kind of stay shoulder to shoulder, which kind of slows down the movement overall. So all those things create this disparity of ability to move. And then as we get in the illusion of movement, this is a challenge in a lot of land warfare games, is where the infantry units are essentially static, where they move one hex. And so they can't really go anywhere, and the tanks are literally just driving circles around them. Now, the reality is tanks could do that, but when we actually study actual combat, the horses and the tanks and the vehicles, and then my own experience in armored combat is with LAV battalions, is you spend a lot of time not moving. So how does that get incorporated in there so you have a more realistic depiction of the level of activity that happens? And then, kind of like the land version of the naval problem, we have a huge range disparity. So a modern tank can shoot accurately at 4,000 meters. Even a World War II tank can engage targets at 800 to 1,000 meters. So that's a pretty fur piece. And infantry weapons are typically after about 500 or 600 meters, you're probably not hitting anything. And really, your sweet spot is in the 300 to 400 meters. And then anything else is close combat with automatic weapons and hand grenades. right? So, so it's quite a disparity there. So a lot of the infantry weapons that are support weapons have even greater ranges. Infantry mortars in the 2 to 6 kilometers. You have heavier mortars that can shoot a dozen kilometers, and then you add in artillery that can shoot in the 20s of kilometers. So quite a spread of ranges how that gets depicted. Most common thing is, oh, well, we put the artillery off board because they're a couple miles back shooting. Well, that depends what you want to show in the game. If you want to have these off-map representations, that's a common way to kind of get around that. Now, one of the other problems we have in land warfare is we have kind of a scale of formations, but the reality behind the formations is different, right? So these are what I call similar echelons with different sizes behind there. So here's an example. A Russian rifle company is a Rota. So a Rota at full strength is 90 soldiers. And so that's a good bit smaller than US or NATO allied type units. And then they don't ever staff them to 100%. It's kind of weird how they do business there, but they tend to think about 50 to 60% of the total strength is good to go. So you're typically seeing companies that are basically a reinforced platoon in our mindset. But if I represent it as a company, then I have a disparity problem. A great game on modern warfare conceptually was the Fifth Corps Hofgap series that they did several of them. Had some really interesting concepts, but it really suffered from one problem where the Russian maneuver units were regiments, and they were very powerful regiments, and then all the NATO units were just battalions. So the NATO player is going to have to get 5 or 6 battalions together to take out a regiment, and that made it very unsatisfying to play because the reality is the Russians have battalions too. You probably would have been better just having everybody battalions, and you would probably get a better sense of the traffic management problem that the Russians would have. But not to beat up the game, there were some really cool concepts in there. And then squads could vary widely, and it matters, right? 6 soldiers, 14 soldiers, or somewhere in between. If you're getting down to squad level, that makes a difference. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. Good doesn't necessarily mean bigger sometimes, based on the experience of the troops. And then in modern warfare, we do a lot of task organization. So if you watch videos coming out of Ukraine, you'll see, oh, there's 3 tanks, 4 BMPs, and you're like, what Frankenstein is that? It's a task organized unit. They took a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put it together, say, go fight. We do that too. So we make these task organized units. How do you represent that in a meaningful way without overwhelming the player? So some basic problems. And that echelon problem goes all the way up to like division, right? So like a Soviet division in World War II was like generally staffed at like 5 to 6,000 soldiers, even though on paper it could have 10 or 12,000 if it was an infantry division. Its tank corps, etc., were a little bit more beefy, but they literally had somewhere over 200. No one knows for sure, depends which book you read, over 200 infantry divisions, but they tended to be at about 5 to 6,000 soldiers. So, do you represent that as a division? Did it cover the frontage of a division, like in a NATO style or even a German style? No. But you don't want to give the idea that the Russians were weak. They just used different size formations for the different jobs. So I alluded to this, but there's a bunch of models that drive the games, right? These games are a collection of modeling different things, right? So you can have a set of models that look at human behavior. And so, human behavior includes things like cohesion and morale and, these things about, is it aggressive? Are they, cowardice and bravery, and all these things are human conditions, fatigue. And so, Squad Leader was one of the early games to really go in. Well, infantry combat has a big morale component, and they kind of popularized that in commercial war games. That hey, this human piece is important. There's other games that have started to bring in that it isn't a platform or a machine. Now, from a gaming standpoint, the platform interaction, it can be attractive because it also takes out some of the more distasteful elements of the human interaction. So we are modeling combat, and with that comes, the idea of killing other people. And if you're really thinking, do you want to draw your entertainment from that? Well, some people can be very squeamish about it, and that's okay. The reality of it is can be disturbing at different levels. But what is it we're trying to model? The interaction of platforms can be a little bit more sanitary. This machine does that, and this machine does that. What's that interaction? But I would argue that the human factors are absolutely critical if you're going to give a more accurate representation. Now, there's a scale of accuracy. Obviously you're not going to go out there and get hurt. It is a cardboard model of some sort of interaction, right? So you're representing certain aspects of parts of it. So you choose the models that you're modeling, and other stuff you have to abstract out, because unless you have unlimited time to play the game, they're just going to have to, you're going to have to take some of it out and focus on what it is. And this goes back to those learning objectives. What do I want people to know from my models about this style of combat? And so that helps drive some of that. Then you have this homogeneous or heterogeneous interactions, right? So some classic war games do a really good job of showing, oh, well, the Roman legions were vastly superior to the Gallic hordes. So, that's a asynchronous, heterogeneous interaction. They're not the same. So part of that model is to show what about this one or that one is better or different than the other. So it's like a compare and contrast model. Whereas homogeneous, a little bit different. The forces are roughly the same. So if I look at the Spanish Succession, the armies were pretty homogeneous between the French and the Dutch and the Germans. At that time, all the battalions were very similar. The equipment was exceedingly similar. The cavalry was exceedingly similar. So what made one better than the other? Right. So what is it that I'm modeling to show why would someone win or lose on that battlefield if there's not something inherently different about the quality or aspects of my soldiers or battlefield formations? And then what will actually make it work better for your players is how the models interact. Now, if they feel like you're just chunking things together in sequence, it can be a bit of a slog. But if you can figure out how to get different models to interact in a meaningful way, it's what we call kind of a design elegance piece that people go, oh, I have to do this to do that, which that's part of the puzzle solving or problem solving aspect that players enjoy about a game. A game comes as a puzzle, which is how do I win? How do I solve the puzzle that this game offers me on winning or at least achieving the learning objectives? So let's talk about combat resolution, because it is a tactical game. There's going to be combat somehow, some way. So there's a couple ways to think about this. One is we have these multi-step system dynamics models. If you're familiar with system dynamics, Jay Forrester up at MIT invented it as we know it today in the 1950s. We use it for a variety of things in analytics and economics, et cetera, across the world. So system dynamics is I've got things that change in states. So it's a sequence of things that I got to do, and I have flows in and out of this sequence of events. So if I have, and so where we see this in a lot of tactical games is I have a set of activities associated with a combat. So I have to do a pre-combat morale check, then I do a defensive fire, then an offensive fire, then I move, then I take a pre-shot check, and then and then there's the actual attack, and then there's the post-attack morale check. So these little sequences laid out, they kind of lay out step by step, and each one is an interaction. Those became really popular in 80s and 90s. People wanted more detail. So some of the earlier war games had abstracted a lot of that out and were single distribution results, which is the next topic. And people had wanted something more detailed. Now, is this a danger of, beware what you ask for because that's what you're going to get. So you got something that was more detailed, but literally might involve hundreds and hundreds of die rolls for a very minimal range of distribution. So nobody wants to roll the dice 500 times trying to avoid rolling an 11, right? So that is, so you can lose some of your illusion, so there's an illusion that comes with the game that the player gets involved with. But if it becomes too much of a grind or interaction, that can break that illusion and it becomes a slog. So the system dynamics kind of use that sparingly, unless you're something absolutely critical that's non-linear that you have to pull out, because system dynamics does a non-linear interaction really well. So if you think about, a percent to detect, a percent to, percent of hit, and then a hit effect. So these sequence of things are pretty common tools. Now, another thing you can do, which I did with several games, is you can lay that out, calculate it underneath the hood into a distribution of results, and then apply one interaction that will do the full range or distribution of results. So I've done that on several games to move along the narrative to hit my time window. So the way I had to explain is, hey, all these things are happening, and this is, you see this in the distribution of results. It's just resolved in a single die roll that will cover everything from I failed my pre-shock morale check to I stormed it at great loss and planted my flag and everything in between. So that is a way to move things along, is you can do that low level system dynamics, but then use that output to create a single mathematical model. Another way that's pretty easy is this bucket of dice is the term, where I just, instead of calculating these discrete things on tables, I just take a bunch of dice based on some factors and fling a bunch of dice and see what it does. That gives you a very interesting ability to measure outliers. Yes, if I roll 20 dice and I'm looking for sixes, the odds of me rolling 26s are incredibly low, but it could happen. So there is some ability to, generally what happens when you're doing a single distribution of results, you're kind of cutting out the outlier a little bit. So keep in mind where that falls out. Now, I'd mentioned a little bit earlier the human impact, morale, cohesion, pinned results, route movements, retreats. Those are all kind of bringing in human factors that that are in the realm of results. Mechanical things are more like, I guess the most classic example would be the original Tobruk, Avalon Hill Tobruk, and then the modern incantation of the Panzer series, where you've got this caliber gun firing this shell from its ghostly crew. You hit this exact spot and check the penetration of that exact spot in the tank based on the range of the shell. And you're like, okay, that's really detailed, and the crews never really influence that. It's like, I'm aiming at the tank, and if it hits there, good. So it's measuring even beyond the level of what the crews themselves would have tracked, other than, oh, I got hit. So that, another aspect of that would be like a lot of classic naval games where you have hit boxes on the ship. The ship takes so many hits. What's the crew doing about it? Where's damage control? What if it happens to hit in a critical crew space? It's got 5 boxes. When you check off 5 boxes, you sank my battleship. All right, so the mechanical part can be fairly prosaic, and how that interacts with the human piece. You can do one or the other, or you can jam 2 together in a meaningful way. So some other design options in a very big way is, let's talk about like the map sheet. I referred to a map sheet. It doesn't have to be an actual map. There's different ways you can do that. Obviously, hex grid is incredibly popular. Why? Because it gives you a nice distribution of movement, but it does bring limitations. A grid of squares brings in limitations as well. But but there's common ways we get around it. There are other styles of maps. So area maps are, like I mentioned, storm over Arnhem and the whole storm over this and that and the other. There's been a whole genre of games using areas. The Next War series uses areas in the naval or maritime domain and does some interesting things with it. Not saying it's the greatest thing, but it helps um, solve the scale problem by saying the ship's in this big box and all this other stuff's going to happen, and there's just chances that these things will happen somewhere in this big box. So it simplifies the scale problem maritime a little bit. But we had the classic war at sea, which was an area movement of ships. So it did the World War II maritime problem in just big zones. And so the zone is like, oh, well, we're going to find you somewhere in that zone. So one of the ones that had very early war games by Rand had a point-to-point series, and then that kind of disappeared into obscurity, and then came back alive with a lot of the Paths of Glory and card-driven games that did these point-to-point maps. I did one myself. That was an operational level game, but that emphasizes something about the idea of a road network and how we don't really move cross country for the most part. Even in 1600s, there was a road network that they traveled on because I can't pull all my junk with me cross country. It turns out Germany is not flat. Then we look at playing pieces. So I do a lot of counters, right? So one of the things that I'm big on is don't put a lot of information on the counter if all the counters are going to say the same thing, right? So kind of big believer of limiting the information on the counter to just the minimum of what's unique to that counter versus everything of the same type. It's the same type, I can just put that like movement allowance. I don't put movement allowance in the musket and pike games or the bayonet and musket because it's the same for everybody of that type. So I just put a little chart on the side of the map, and plus it's very easy to remember. And it's 4 for these guys, 6 for the light infantry, and 8 for cavalry. That's it. Easy to remember. So save space. You can put some cool artwork, which the players appreciate. They like some cool artwork, and kind of emphasize on just the essential elements of information on the counter. I'm not as young as I used to be, so the more it's on there, I can't see it anyway. I have to wear my big reading glasses. So so you can be judicious, but there's plenty of style of things where they have like 8 different factors and little icons next to the numbers. I just can't see them clearly, so I kind of personally avoid it. But a lot of people love it, so that's no problem. Just keep in mind that it's a little hard to read, even on fairly large pieces. But a lot of info there. Now, the other one that's really popular, blocks or meeples or some physical thing, right? So blocks, they give you some idea. They can be flipped, they can be turned. So you got some options in the physicality of a block. A meeple, not so much. The meeple is just a thing or represents a pawn, if you will. A lot of games are popular to do that because you don't really need anything more than this is an army marker. Fine. That representation is good, and and it's tactile. People can feel it, touch it. Cards are incredibly popular. So I've got a game that uses cards for the map as well as for interaction. So the cards it's an area map that you use cards to build the map. So that's like a tile laying game from the Euro non-war game side. Is I lay tiles and create a map. In Fields of Fire, I use cards to do that. It is a variation of what originally up front was kind of the original, kind of in the modern war game, using cards for low level. Now that was at individual soldier level, so it had a lot of abstraction. So Fields of Fire takes it up a level, less abstraction in that regard. But cards can function a variety of ways. One of the nice things about cards is they're pretty easy to make for play test. You can make cards and get them printed on cardstock and cut them out or put them in sleeves. Not very difficult to do. Nice thing about cards is you got a little bit more space for some cool artwork. People love artwork or pictures. And you can also kind of put a little bit more information than you could put on a small counter that could you make it a little bit easier to play. It also has that gaming aspect of playing a hand of cards or laying cards or taking tricks. You have those. There's a set of card mechanics that are kind of in the collective consciousness of anybody that grew up in a country that plays cards. Right, so there's sets of card games. So if you've played Hearts and Rummy and Go Fish over your lifetime, you have this kind of collective memory that you can tap into in your game design that helps people understand the concept. Um, Now, dice and randomization, I mentioned that a little bit earlier, the combat resolution piece. You get your 6-siders, your 10-siders. I like 10-sided because I like a linear distribution between 1 and 10, but that's a personal preference. Or you can go what I call the Dungeons and Dragons mix. It's 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 20. You got all things in there. I know like Tim Barrick and the OWS guys, they color coded it, which is fairly cool idea to say not only are you using a range of different dice, but you have a common color code between the die itself and the icon on the card that helps make it a little bit easier for the player to figure it out. So all of which is cool. So keep in mind, linear modifiers to a die roll in a non-linear dice distribution. So, if I get a +1, +2, +3 for different things on a 2d6, that +2 is not the same as +2 on a d10, right? So understanding where you want to get the odds distribution, odds distribution on dice is pretty easy to calculate. So just keep in mind what it is you're trying to depict and what the influence of dice roll modifiers are. Those are super common in a lot of games. Yes, this is the baseline distribution, but I will either be better or worse due to these factors from the model. That you do get some wonkiness if you get too many modifiers against a nonlinear distribution. Card randomization. So I mentioned cards. If you're using card randomization, is insanely complicated math. So not for the faint of heart, because when I play a card, it really calculates the odds that a particular card is played. That's why gambling is such a big deal. It's very difficult to count cards. There's systems of counting cards. Some movies about it that actually work, but it works over time. All right, so card randomization can give you some cool mechanics, but you're opening a little bit more of a can of worms on what is your desired distribution of results, and does that match your historical model or whatever model you invented? So just keep in mind that now you could do a linear distribution or a Gaussian distribution across the cards, but keep in mind once cards are being played, that distribution is dynamic based on what's already played and what's still in the hand. There's some ways to redo that. You can do that through a reshuffle card to kind of or use mechanics to churn the deck faster so you retain closer to your original distribution of values. So those are ways to kind of reduce the painful complexity of card odds. And that's really if you have a specific deck of cards or specific set of distributions aligned to the cards. So now, this one kind of gets back to this idea of first off, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything's been done in one shape or form. We're always kind of adapting something. However, you can do something that's pretty novel, something that hasn't been done in a long time, or you take something that is, kind of new to this particular aspect, or you haven't seen it before, new to you. It really is probably the most important thing. So when you do something new, one of the challenges is it comes with a learning curve, right? So it's a lot harder to get a game accepted. So if you've been designing for a while, it's easier for you to do something different if you've kind of established, hey, this guy's not crazy. Maybe we should try this new thing. Sometimes the novelty of it will attract people. Oh, I've not seen this done this way before. I'm interested to see how it does. So that may be a way to attract people who would not otherwise necessarily be interested in the subject matter. But it does come with this kind of learning curve, or this kind of trepidity about trying something new. Some people are just stuck in their ways. So, but don't be afraid to try something new, because I think especially nowadays, where the entry level and the ability to design something useful is a lot easier than it used to be. Back when I started, I had hand-drawn maps. And this was like manually. Now you can do this on a computer much faster, much more accurately. We have access to much more historical records that were very difficult to find 20 or 30 years ago. So there's is like a golden age of the ability to design something. So don't be afraid to try something new just because it's new or different. But understand that it's going to come with the newness. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this game design kind of broke into patterns. So if you do something new within the pattern, there may be resistance to acceptance because they're used to seeing it done a certain way. It's not bad, but it's just, up front, if you're going to go down that way, understand that there may be challenges to that. Now, the classic approach is just adapt something. There's like 5 million games on Waterloo, right? Well, how am I going to do something new about Waterloo, or something new about Gettysburg? The big two classic historical battles have been gamed more than any other battle. And so I can adapt something really easy. I say, okay, here's some familiar concepts, but I want to introduce this one thing that's different, or should have been this. And so that is it comes with a low learning or acceptance curve, because people are like, oh, I'm familiar with this. Okay, I get it. So what's different about this? Oh, this and this are different, so that you get this different result. Oh, okay. And so it's a little bit quicker to move things along if there's something similar. However, if you're going to do another Waterloo game, there's 5 million Waterloo games, right? So it can create a crowded market of things that look very alike. So a classic example with Gettysburg, everybody loves play. 2 games came out last couple of years. There's the let's see, get my names right. There's the most fearful sacrifice. I got the name right. It's got it somewhere on my shelf over here on the other side of my. I got it. It's a big giant box, and it's beautiful. It's a map, a beautiful map, but it has a concept in the model of they call it like the Black Swan system. So it's a high range of different things that can go sideways on you. A lot of cards in the command system. And then Grant Wiley did a game, it literally came out the same year on Gettysburg through his system that is a lot more attritional. You kind of grind through the battle. And so it has a different aspect of it. So what we did like last year at World Board Game Championships is we set both up side by side, played literally the same scenario side by side, and kind of compare and contrast for the folks around to say, well, if you like this is great. If you like this is great. Me personally, I like Grant Wiley's games. It's a little bit manageable. It's a lower rules overhead, and actually gets into the attritional combat side at the brigade level that I think is a more realistic model of how they fought in that day and age. But a lot of people love the I think it's Herman Lutman did the other one, and it's a beautiful game. It's got some cool bits to it. So not a criticism of that game itself. Just 2 familiar subjects, still hex and counter. It is interesting to put the 2 map sheets together and see, well, why is that one this level, or where do they draw the stream here? Because there's a couple of differences on the maps, just because you have to conform reality to the hex grid. And it turns out, real life isn't a hex grid. Now, as I alluded to, because I express a personal preference is a huge factor because it is a large market of tactical games, and people have preferences, and they're weird about it. It's like, I don't like strawberries. I don't care how you dress up a strawberry. I'm still not going to like it. I'm sorry. It's a personal preference. Nothing against people who love strawberries or people who grow strawberries for a living, but it's just a personal preference. that is a big deal with people, especially in the commercial space. It is a hobby. And so your personal preference is very much a part of the hobby. And some people will, be very vocal about it, which is their right to be. Don't get your feelings hurt. It's a personal preference. There's a lot of good constructive feedback that comes in. That's great. Sometimes they're just expressing a personal preference, and that's great. Uh, yeah, just had a okay. Hopefully, in the design game, people express a preference. So, like example, on a hex grid, when I'm dealing with linear warfare, if I get the jagged line and the line because the units have facing it, but they face a hex side since a hex juncture, that's a hard no for me. I just don't like it. It visually in my brain, it's not a representation of linear warfare. I get to be a weirdo because I'm paying the money to buy the games I want to play. So doesn't prevent somebody from playing the game. So again, personal preference is a big deal, especially the commercial side. In the professional side, it manifests itself differently. So in professional wargaming, there's a lot of folks on the military or industrial complex side that have a preference against commercial games. They're like, oh, those are just weirdo hobby guys. And yes, some of us are weirdo hobby guys, but there's actually some good mechanics. So to build a professional game for which a commercial game does the same thing already at a much lower price entry point could actually be a good investment if you just get past your preference or bias against it. Now, there's some professional games you have to design specifically for that audience. Either the subject is classified, et cetera, et cetera. But there is some preference issues that, just part of the marketplace. All right. So I'm going to do an example of some modeling that I've done for a game that's under design to give you an idea of some trade-offs or some thoughts on how to work through something familiar, but not, right? So, walk through, it's a design that I'm working on that is in the land domain. I'm starting in World War II because the technology is a little bit more simple. But the idea is it can move forward like some of my other designs as the technology moves forward. So the scale is set at 500-meter hex grid, right? So I built that because at 500 meters is about the frontage or the range at which small arms fire can work out to 500 meters. And then after that, you have something else to shoot farther. The maneuver elements are rifle companies. So this is not an area that gets as much gaming in the broad spectrum. There's, interestingly enough, there's a lot of battalion and a lot of division scale games, and then there's a lot of squad level games. There's not a ton of stuff in the middle. Now you could say that the classic Panzer Leader Panzer Blitz was like a platoonish company level, but it was more platoons or half companies when you actually look at the stuff under the hood. But the turn system is meant to be an hour, so it's not going to get super detailed in the combat interaction. It's looking at a different process. So the modeling focus here is on command and control. So with the detail is built on the time needed for planning and developing and disseminating orders. So this is something from a modeling standpoint that doesn't get covered in a lot of tactical games. Why? Because it's work. People don't want to do the work. They want the units to magically move when they want them to move. But the educational standpoint is, well, the reason units don't just move willy-nilly over the map is they have to have orders, they have to have plans, they have to communicate and coordinate, and these orders have to be disseminated to a highly decentralized battlefield. So you've got a basic problem of, I have a great idea. How does Private Snuffy and Company C know that? So I got to come up with a plan, develop an order, write the order, issue the order, and disseminate and conduct rehearsals, drills, and staging. Right. So all those activities have to take place. And guess what? There's a standard battle rhythm where battalions could do that every day. They could do that generally that cycle once a day, maybe twice if they kept it simple. So how do I build that into a system? I'll show you. We use this concept of orders restrictions. So a unit is given an order, and that restricts what he can and can't do on the playing area. So the player would be at the regimental level. means the player is in the role of a colonel or brigadier, and he will have 3 battalions of 3 companies, which is 9 maneuver units. So keeps that a fairly small number of maneuver units because we're going to be doing a lot of stuff with each one. The headquarters and supporting arms are represented, but the headquarters and some mortar positions will be on the map, but a lot of the other stuff is just support bits that move around. So the counter density is relatively low on the map itself. One of the key things that we want to bring out is the enemy location uncertainty is a crucial part of warfare that day and age. Now, in recent events where we have drones, where we have pervasive surveillance of the battlefield, different problem. But in this day and age, knowing exactly where the enemy was very difficult and dangerous task. And that was a large amount of what the infantry units had to do was advance, gain, and maintain contact with the enemy so that we can know exactly where they are so we can blow them into next week. Because the powerhouse is artillery, but the artillery only works if I know exactly where they are. So if I look at a hex that's 500 meters across, a rifle company that is entrenched physically occupies less than 18% of the surface area of that hex. So I have to find them in that hex and zero in the artillery fire. And then the shocking truth to everybody is, turns out your maps are not accurate. I cannot control supporting arms from a map. You will not hit the target. The maps are drawn as an approximation. So somebody actually has to zero in the artillery fire to know that they hit it. So that is a big problem. It's a big part of the activity that rifle companies do. Then I built in a loss rate model that is attritional but nonlinear. Did some analysis behind that. And then the companies have formations or distributions on the ground that change their firepower distribution. So I've got some slides that will kind of walk through how that looks. So this is the company firepower and loss model. So I've got a U.S. rifle company at top. It's a lot of little numbers. You don't have to read the exact numbers. That's okay. But the model looks at the total authorized strength, breaks it down by what I call squad equivalent units, or SEUs, for my own modeling purpose. So I can break down where it's a rifle squad, a separate machine gun squad, mortar squad, and then I associate a firepower level and then a manning level. And then we have some concepts called manpower depth and tactical depth. And then, so as the loss rate hits you, you have a certain amount of depth in manpower where you can absorb loss. So that maintains the same firepower through your initial loss rate, because the company has a certain amount of manpower depth depending on the size and strength of the company at the starting point of the battle. Then you have a tactical depth. So based on the distribution of the company on the ground, they typically keep a platoon in reserve. That's their tactical depth. So that is firepower they kind of keep in reserve that they can distribute so that the company is more resilient. But some formations will sacrifice tactical depth to cover more frontage. So we'll get into that in a second. And so you'll see that, like the German Fallschirmjäger company in 1944 that were fighting in the Normandy campaign, they have 2 machine guns and a rifle squad. So they have a fundamental firepower advantage over the U.S. rifle company. So they don't have this same amount of depth because the company is a little bit smaller, so in strength. But they have the advantage in most of this campaign of being on the defense. So that's going to make it tough for our American friends. So that builds a nonlinear loss rate. So no reduction in firepower through the manpower depth. And then once you get through your tactical depth, then you start incrementally losing firepower, because now as you take losses, you're losing losses in the fundamental ability to generate firepower. So it's nothing, tactical depth, then a slow, well, it could be fast depending on the situation, but it's a tick, as each point ticks off. So it turns out a lot of the infantry combat is grueling and attritional. So it shows that in the model. So this is looking at some formations in the distribution of firepower model. So this Able company, in a linear, so the the counter is two-sided, so it has a linear and a perimeter on the back side. So as a linear distribution with the flanks open, that's the distribution model of the firepower, proportionally speaking. There is an extended a formation where I'm reducing my tactical depth, but extending my company out. And then if I'm attacking, I'm concentrating the company in a more tight formation so the firepower is distributed to the front of the attacking company. There's a perimeter defense where my firepower is distributed evenly in all directions, but I have no tactical depth because I have to face outboard. And then if I'm tied into adjacent unit in close formations like that, the center of the two units has a high firepower overlap. That's interlocking firepower. So there's a couple ways to do how to model this. So what I did, because I'm lazy, is I made a bunch of these little chits that I put on a display card. You could keep track on a card as well where that lost model on. You could tick those off. But this allows me to just use each squad equivalent unit as one or two chits. And then I can just use them in this battalion display for each company who's where. And then at the bottom, you see the planning, writing, coordination, dissemination, and staging and execution. That's the timeline. So one turn is what it takes to move through the basic order cycle. I've got to plan, write, coordinate, disseminate, and execute. So it's going to take 1, 2, 3, and on the 4th hour, I can go into execution of that order. Unless I do one of these things. If I'm doing a night op, a deliberate attack or defense, a relief in place, or those are going to add time in the planning, and it'll also add time in the coordination distribution if it's at night or a deliberate attack or passage of lines. Those require a lot of extra coordination. But the advantage of doing a deliberate attack or deliberate defense is you get to use more supporting arms. So you get more firepower for it. But are you going to lose the time in planning if the enemy launches a more rapid counterattack or offensive action? So you get this, there's a planning cycle. And so that's the key is, can you get through your planning cycle and execute in a time where it's inconvenient to the adversary? Now, I talked a little bit about location certainty. So this is kind of a model of the options that you have with contact and target location accuracy. So you see the little target marker there. The model on the upper right-hand side says you've got a known location where your fire is fully effective. You have a location, a general location. That's half the firepower. Then you got a suspected location, and then you got an unknown. There's a marker on the map, but I don't really know for sure if he's there. So you got to find them, and that's what the infantry get to do. Is they get to go find the bad guys. The bad guys are waiting for you to try to find them because they're going to ambush you. So you see, if I'm in close contact in adjacent hexes, I have a known location. I have made contact with the enemy, and I have a known location for them. Where we see here is this ability to push patrols out. So that's that lightning symbol is a map symbol for patrols. So this is one of the key things that infantry units do, is this idea of patrolling. So integrating that into the game with a simple marker is a way to get the infantry units to do what they're supposed to do, which is they attack, they defend, and they patrol. That's the three functions of these things. What do they do patrols for? Well, they do patrols to find the enemy or deny the enemy finding them. So we see in the next example, Able Company's patrol we have a known location for the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion. And so then we go here, if they both push out patrols, we both have suspected locations because we're both doing counter reconnaissance and we're kind of canceling each other out. And then we have different options here where there's a combat outpost for 3rd Company. So I can find the combat outpost, but I still suspect where his main line of resistance is. Then if I have open ground between us, but we're not adjacent, I still can generate a general location. If I have 2 open ground between us, it's suspected. Or if I have close terrain between us, it's unknown. Yeah. So this kind of gives options of how that plays out on the map. And the map simplifies terrains is either close terrain or open terrain. And then you'll have some elevations. And this looks at how the orders work with offensive operations. A deliberate attack, hasty attack, movement, contact are the three types of offensive operations that are available in the game, and they're generally what we have in the real world as well. So the deliberate attack takes longer to plan and execute, but you get to fire your prep fires. Then the German has defensive fire, and then you do the assault combat. Whereas if you do a hasty attack, defensive fire first. You got to advance, and then, and it's even worse because, you know, in a movement to contact, you may get ambushed, and you might not actually get a full location on them. So it takes your chances, but that's how you find the bad guys. That was the stark reality of combat in Normandy, and often in modern infantry combat is some version of this same problem. And then we start layering in things like more terrain between them, or dug in, or fortified or trench positions, give the defender more advantages, all of which make it very difficult to unseat a defending enemy on good terrain. That's why you need to take the time to blast them out of existence with a deliberate attack when you have the chance. So what that did was kind of wrap some different types of trade-offs or different models and how you can integrate the models. So I can integrate an order system with the target location model so that they interact in a relatively simple but meaningful way. How do I improve this? I have to do an order. I have to go through the order process to get the right order to move the unit into proximity so that I can adjust my location so that my fire can be more effective, so that I can eliminate them and take the battalion objective. So that is a simple kind of walkthrough of how one could do a relatively complex design. So I got a firepower distribution, but then there's a firepower results, and the results are just in squad equivalent units taken out of action. So that particular combat results pretty straightforward. There could be some morale results as well, and location change results based on the situation. So kind of as I kind of wrap this up, the niche that I do, which to kind of put it in some perspective on my remarks, is I specialize in doing commercial land domain games as a designer. I was an infantry officer, so I'm pretty well versed in that. Although I have a lot of knowledge on air and maritime domains, a lot of that is related to my day job. But I can speak very intelligently about that, but I have not designed any games myself on that, but I played a lot of them because I find the subjects interesting, and they're very difficult to game in a meaningful way compared to reality. GMT Games is my primary publisher, so shout out to GMT Games. I have done some other stuff, but almost everything that I've done that you can find is with GMT Games. Good, high quality stuff. Pretty excited with the Fields of Fire Deluxe. If you're familiar with that one, looks kind of like, it's a big heavy box. Looks like this, and excited to see that hit in the street. That's the third printing of the first volume of Fields of Fire, but we went all in at GMT. Got some great developers, a good team. The artwork is just really top notch. Pretty excited with that. I design complex games. I'm sorry, that's what I do. If you want like a really simple game, there's plenty of them out there. And again, personal preference. I just like a little bit more meat on the bone. So not going to apologize. It's just the way it is. So if you can't really see, but in this war room that I'm in is not huge. I don't have room to do large footprint games. So I typically do one map, or something that fits into one map footprint with very little exception, maybe one or two cards. So that's about it off the one map. So trying to keep it at a manageable footprint, because I physically, in my design space, I have that restriction. So I assume other people are going to have it. But that's the world that my wife allows me to live in. Yay. I typically do games that take 3 to 5 hours to play because they're complicated. So I try to kind of keep them from going into the giant 6+ hours. Now, there are guys out there that play the game super slow. I can't help that. but I don't design it for people who play them super fast either. You have to kind of think about the move. You might have to look up a rule, etc. So that 3 to 5 is based on a typical player, not super speedy guy who has memorized everything, or the super slow guy who has analysis paralysis. Got to be in the middle. I use a lot of the informational markers. As you saw in the example, there was informational markers there, that location stuff, all that. It's fiddly. I use a lot of information markers. Why? Because I get up and take breaks. I'm not as young as I used to be, so I got to get up every so often, move around. And so because of that, I got to remember what the heck's going on. So informational markers help me keep track of what's going on. So I assume if I need to help keeping track, that most players will. Now, I will note that during a turn, I can do a lot of stuff and not use all the markers because I know what's going on. But then I'm going to make sure I get them all in there before I take a break so I don't forget what I just did. So people go, why the informational markers? Because I can't remember everything. And I'm going to get up and use the restroom or whatever, or get a snack. So This Accursed Civil War was the first game that I published with GMT Games back in 2001. So it's been 10 plus games since then. So super happy with that. That is a tactical war game from the English Civil War. So I've done a lot of games about 17th century warfare. Why 17th century? Relatively long story. Happy to answer questions on that, but it is from a force structure or organization, that's the beginning of standing national armies as we know it, right? So yes, the Romans did it, and that's an interesting subject. But in the modern era, we started in about 1620, 1635, 34, depending who you ask, with standing national armies and these existing force structures that are very familiar to us today, but as in their genesis version, right? What was a battalion? What was a company? We still have these things, but how did they start? And what do they look like? And how do they fight? Find that interesting. I do a lot of historical research behind the games, so that is a big part of like Fields of Fire, like the expansion that I'm doing for Tarawa Saipan. Read a bunch of books on it, trying to work with National Archives to get the information that I can, which is a pain for World War II. I've got really good stuff for the Vietnam stuff from National Archives. So I got a different thing I'm working on for Fields of Fire with another Vietnam campaign for the Marines. Heck, if I get enough, we can just write a book about it and do the game. Who knows? But I love playing a lot of tactical games. I don't play a lot of strategic games because I find, again, preference. It's very difficult to model the political aspects of the strategy level and to doing it in a meaningful way. Given that I work at a strategic level, you kind of look through the game and go, oh, it's much more complicated than that. But I also find it dreadfully dull because it's my day job. So I don't get to fight as much. And then there's a picture from way back when I was way cooler and didn't have to have a beard to hide my ugly face in the Marines doing Marine stuff. I want to have a shout out to some different ways to play and learn games. So Circle DC literally next weekend, but they'll do it again next year, etc. Keep up the go. It is a long weekend here in town, DC that is. I'm down in Stafford, Virginia, but I work up there. So that is a 3-day weekend. Great chance to meet some game designers and other players, see some different things, meet people, learn some things. A lot of nice folks. If you're a GMT fan, they do a GMT East up in Schenectady, New York, and I'll be there in April. And they do a GMT West out in Hanford, California. It's at the warehouse. So if you're out in San Diego, when I was out there, I would go out there up to Hanford when I was stationed out in Pendleton. Not a long drive, pretty drive up to Hanford. And if you like the smell of onions, because it's very much a bucolic area. But super nice folks, a lot of fun, met some wonderful folks. A lot of good times there. World Wargaming Championship, mentioned earlier, WBC through the Board Game Players Association, BPA runs that up in Pennsylvania. So it's a 3-hour drive up to Seven Springs, a bajillion games there. You don't have to play at tournaments. I go there, I've gone there for 20 years. I don't play any tournaments. I go to open gaming. I show my stuff. If you go into the open gaming area, GMT Games is right at the front because we're a sponsor, and I got my stuff set up. Happy to show or do anything with anybody that comes by. We got a great game store here in DC. Labyrinth Games has a great selection. Complete Strategist in your New York City, not far from Empire State Building. Great. My store's packed. So there's stores out there that have some really good tactical games worth looking at. There's online stuff. So if Vassal and Tabletop Simulator are kind of the two top engines out there. There's a few others, but those two that can bring a board game into your computer and you can take it with you. If you don't have the space or you're on the road or what have you, those are great ways to play great board games on your computer. And so Tabletop Simulator is pretty cool because it's 3D modeling. You get kind of this weird 3D view of it. Vassal's a little bit more straightforward. Just picture the map and the pieces. You move them around, play the game. Um, so just great ways to learn different things about tactical gaming or strategic or operational games and thing. And then I'm at the end of my speaking bit. I will throw one last thing in. I do have a book coming out with Marine Corps University Press on military readiness. That should be out in August, September timeframe. It's in copy editing now. We've gone through all the peer review and all that fun stuff. That's more my day job, not necessarily about tactical wargaming per se, but I got to put the pitch in there. I don't get any royalties. It is through a university publication. So, truth in advertising, just trying to get the word out that there's more to military readiness than meets the eye, and happy to share with folks that are interested. And questions?
Hey, Ben, thanks for sharing. So the first question I have is, shouldn't the chosen unit scale also reflect the Army's command style, i.e., at what level were real tactical / operational decisions being made in different armies?
So that's a great question. So how you represent it and how that gets represented. So the classic is the Russian example that I used for Fifth Corps. Are they making operational decisions at the regimental or brigade level, and we're making operational decisions at the battalion level? And I'd say, well, sort of depends. It depends what you're modeling and where they are. So you could still model So I would say the game. It was TAC Air everybody had battalions, and so you still you get an idea of the traffic jam or traffic management problem of handling the regiments. So in the Fifth Corps example, the Russians were making decisions at a higher level, but their equivalent decision making space. So that's the challenge is you can have the units at the right level at the right echelon, but with the right strength. But you got to be clear who's making the decision. So so if you're modeling the Soviet Union, they use very different terminology. So a corps is not a corps; it is a brigade, or it's a division-sized unit, but it means something different to have a corps in Soviet-style warfare versus a division. Uh, so but if I have a group of divisions, they're called an army. Whereas we would have the term army at a whole other level. We would call that a corps. And actually, so the term corps in Russian is used differently because where we use the word corps, which is French for body, the Russian actual word for that is polk. The polk, and that's why a Russian colonel is a polkovnik, because in how they develop their armies over time, uh, the term that we use for a corps, they used for became a regiment, and so the polkovnik is that term that's uniquely Russian or Slavic, because it's the same thing in Polish and some other Slavic languages, but so the evolution of the terminology is different. So that's why they didn't just make it different to be difficult. It is a linguistic difference in how they associated their formations. But understanding who's making the decision and how it works is really key. So in that game, is that really the operational decision at the regiment level? Is the regiment really the level at which they're maneuvering? And it sort of depends on the frontage. Now, could I stack a bunch of battalions and then have an equivalent unit to the single regiment? Maybe. That's a design decision. So I'm not saying it's wrong, but the echelon and it should be what you're trying to model at the right decision level. So don't arbitrarily say, I'm just doing a game at the division level. So if your divisions are 5,000, my divisions are 15, tough. You're gonna have 200 divisions against my, although technically the Germans had about 200 divisions on the at the high water mark on the East Front. But by then their division started getting really small. But it's so long way to say, sort of depends what you're trying to model, but it should represent the actual decisions they made or at the level they made. So it seems like the critical operational level, if you're going to do like an East Front for Soviet style, the key command decision level was at the Army level. And so, so how that interacted with the German operational piece would be interesting, because the Army group level controlled a lot. There's some really good books. Glance, of course, does the voluminous volume series of the detail, but I think is it David or Roger Forsick just did some really good stuff on armored warfare on the East Front that really kind of brings out some interesting nuance that's worth looking at if you like that style of tactical warfare. It's a little bit more straightforward on the Western Front because the Germans and Americans and British all had roughly similar style formations. It's just, the Germans had less and less mechanization and fuel and other issues that made them less effective. That help?
No, that's great. Next question I have is how well has actual combat in Ukraine reflected modern warfare tactical games? That's the first question, and then I have another one right after that.
So that is an excellent question. And so we have watched that with very closely. And so you got to be careful with. So it looked different than what a lot of people think. And so I think a lot of there's a popular genre of games that are modern warfare games. There's a few of them that are like modern, but there's like a ton of them that are like, hey, let's refight 1985. What if there had been a war in the Fulda Gap and those. So those are interesting, but that's one of the challenges we have with like an analytical war game in the professional circles versus a commercial war game. So I would caution people with a lot of you can fit, is what we call fitting the model. I can fit the model to what we're seeing, but there's some very important troop quality aspects, right? So I think a lot of people grossly overestimated the capability of the Russian ground forces and underestimated the capability of the Ukrainian ground forces. And so, just try to be quick about it. When the war started, there was one key decision point: were the Ukrainians going to fight? Right. So from 2014 going towards the start of the current war, when that war started, they had 35 standing brigades in the Ukrainian army. That's pretty significant ground force. And even with some problems of being kind of caught with some people who didn't necessarily want to fight, overall they wanted to fight. There was like one exception, how they got all the way through coming out of Crimea up to right there at the darn bridge there, the Alexandria Bridge. They got across that bridge without a fight, and that was a huge mess up on the part of Ukrainian defense. But most of the other defenders stood up. But it was pretty obvious if you go through the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians weren't postured to deliver a truly effective military attack. They were coming from every known direction. Their forces were way too distributed. There was not a decisive mass or logistic support in the, so they weren't developing this kind of critical mass of this unstoppable penetrating attack. And then their prep fires were pretty lame, to be perfectly honest. Their shock and awe was a lot of missiles distributed a lot of places. But you fired too many missiles at too many targets. You could have fired the same missiles at half a number of targets and had more effect. So it was a lot of show. And when the show didn't work, they got punched hard in the face. And so what has happened is they have kind of deconstructed their forces, and then understanding the mindset of the Russian ground forces is important. What do Americans study? What imbues our view of the world? They have a different view in their military mindset, and that's not a criticism; it's just different. Right? So the Great Patriotic War is absolutely like the canon, you know, and that's like going against the Bible. So that imbues very deeply into the ethos of the Russian ground forces and the VBS, the Air Force. And so one of the things like, why does the Air Force suck so bad? Well, it's because they never did what our Air Force did, and they never did what the British Air Force or even the Luftwaffe did. They've never done a comprehensive air campaign. They've only ever flown in support of ground maneuver. It's frontal aviation. Literally, that was the name of the Air Force, was frontal aviation. They had a separate strategic aviation, which was like the nuclear stuff. And then they ran out of money and they put them together, and it's VKS now, is the Russian Aerospace Forces. So it's just jamming in there because we ran out of money. But they've never done like a bombing campaign, an air campaign like we've done repeatedly. We did an air campaign against Germany, Japan, uh, Korea, Vietnam. Whether or not they're successful or not, that's strategically speaking, then that's not really the point. Is that we planned and executed long-term, sustained, complex air campaigns, which they have never ever done. They have no real doctrine for it, no knowledge. So their Air Force has some cool airplanes, but it's very limited in its utility because it is a constraint of their imagination. They've never done it before. They can't even have a concept of what it means. So without that, that's one of the key components to modern maneuver warfare, is the ability to use air power to blast your way through. Now, one of the challenges that we're having in a large is I mentioned earlier, the pervasive surveillance. So one of the challenges we have now is because of the cheap drones that see everywhere, we see everywhere. Now, we had a different version of that in Afghanistan, where we had all these ISR assets where we can see everywhere. Well, the problem is you can see everywhere. Well, where is important? Well, look where the tank is moving first, right? So a little bit more difficult when we're trying to find a guy digging a hole to plant a bomb in. I can see a tank moving, and we know that's bad, right? So find the tanks, find the BMPs. So, so how it plays out, and then the other part is the Ukrainians are still stuck in the Soviet mindset too. So they're like the same guys fighting each other because they came from the same spiritual background. So they're trying to adopt some NATO and Western style because they know it's more effective soldier for soldier, but they're having a really hard time doing it. So it is a challenge. So how would Western troops do against the Russian Federation? Well, based on what I'm seeing, we'd beat the living snot out of them, but it would still cost us. They know how to shoot, and they have plenty. Their weapons are deadly. Now, are they as effective as ours? They don't have to be. They're good enough. So there's something to be said about good enough in modern warfare. Trench clearing, it doesn't matter if you're good or bad. Trench clearing is very hard, rugged infantry work. There's no easy way to do that. Unless you can drive a bulldozer up like we did the Iraqis and just bulldoze them into their trenches. It turns out that's hard to do when you have a lot of anti-tank capability, which they do, especially the FPV drones. Now, what would good electronic warfare do? Depends. Now, the fiber optic stuff, that's a new wrinkle on the whole electronic warfare bit, but it's a rapid loop. But it is pretty terrifying to be seeing the soldiers hunted down by the FPV drones and blowing them limb from limb. That sounds like that. Warfare is pretty bad, but that's pretty bad. So I don't know if that answers the question. The Russian soldiers are just barely trained, and the Ukrainians are really just barely trained. There's just a few units that they have that are either better motivated or better trained or some combination. So like the Russians use their naval infantry brigades extensively and the VDV brigades extensively, not necessarily because they're better trained. It's just they seem to be a little bit more motivated than the regular ground force units, which just get chewed up terribly. But yeah, the standard rota is about maybe 50 or 60 dudes, and they don't really understand how to mass effectively. And the pervasive surveillance makes classic massing for offensive operations very difficult. And we've equipped both sides, or we've equipped the Ukrainians, and the Russians already had extensive indirect fire assets. So if you mass for offensive operations, you got to do it fast, or you have to have a comprehensive counterfire plan that'll shut down their artillery. And they both seem to struggle with synergy of effects. I can do counterfire, but can you do it at the right time and place so I can mass for the attack? That's what both sides just really haven't mastered. That's why we see both sides really struggle with offensive operations. Where the Ukrainians have had success is attacking where the Russians aren't, which is good. I mean, that's better than nothing. But eventually you're going to have to penetrate a defended position. And if they can't take Svadova or Kremina, they're not going to win.
So on that note, their follow-up question was, is there a particular game that proved to be particularly accurate in predicting what we're seeing on the ground there right now?
I'd have to say, I think most of the games that I've seen do not predict what we're seeing. So you'd have to kind of reintegrate new effects. Now, are those effects able to be modeled? Yeah, I think you'd have to, or the human factor of just the poorly trained troops on both sides. I mean, I love the Ukrainians; are great, they're brave. They ain't getting a lot of training because they're under duress. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. But on the other hand, they didn't conscript anybody between 18 and 25. And then you're like, well, that's a significant pool of manpower that you haven't even conscripted. What the heck? Um, can I take you seriously if you want? Heck, we would conscript 18-year-olds from day one. And in fact, we take 18 and 19-year-olds first. And they seem to be wanting to take them last, which is weird. But no, I would say there's no really good game to depict it. You'd have to kind of build it based on it. And then the problem is it's highly dynamic. And so if you get too detailed, you run the danger of overfitting. So you probably have to take a step back and kind of model in general this loop that provides this kind of pervasive surveillance and the inability to mass troops effectively. So the challenge is modeling the ineffectiveness of it. We're good at modeling when things work well or what we would like them to do. Modeling how they don't work or how hard that is really the challenge.
And to add a quick, facilitator's comment here, I would also say, like, having looked at the Ukraine conflict, one of the games I'm reminded of is actually a really old game. It's called Panzer Guderian, about the Eastern Front in World War II. And that game has a mechanic
Yep.
where the Soviets don't know the combat value or uh, essentially the combat effectiveness of their units until they throw them into the fire and they start engaging. So like a division can actually have like a quarter of the combat value of like a German brigade, right? But you'll have a couple like really heroic units that are better than their actual organizational size. And I see a lot of that dynamic of like you don't know how good a unit that's fresh off the sort of training pipeline or what little of it exists um, is until you throw it into the fray.
Yeah.
I have one last question, and
And
unless someone else throws a question
yeah.
in the chat.
Okay.
which is, in your experience, how many playtesting sessions, trial and error, are usually necessary to ensure that a newly designed game has no gaps, loopholes in its rules, and what would be a good process to follow to ensure realism and stable play?
All right, so yeah, I'll be quick. So there's no perfect way. So uh, so I think it's not a number, but it's who does the play testing. So I've learned this the hard way. So this is not like, oh, we do it great every time. No, I've learned it painfully over the years. What we've done or trying to get better at doing on the commercial side is we play test first is does the we got to validate the model. Does the model produce the expected results? I do a lot of historical bits or have a historical set of outcomes. So the first thing the model has to do in playtest is does it produce historical results similar if I do roughly the same things as historical participants. So that's kind of job one is it's got to be able to reproduce the results. And then two is then you can start playing edge case, right? Well, what if I do something completely different? Because there's a guy in every crowd. And then the real trick, I think, to finding gaps or holes in the rules is then having a new set of testers come in and test it after you've done that foundational work. That's absolutely, I found the best way to do it. The challenge is I can get volunteers to give me decent feedback. That has been the bane of play testing over the years is getting enough play testers to give you a broad enough set of runs, right? So, like Fields of Fire is very popular. We can get play testers nowadays, you know, tons of them because it's a popular game. The Musk and Pike is a popular game, so I get a lot of play testers with a brand new one. It's a little bit harder, and so I used to have to actually make a full playtest kit and send it to somebody, like making the counters and stuff. Nowadays, I can send them all the PDFs and they can make the pieces or play it on Vassal, etc. So you can make a playtest kit in Vassal and not a physical one. And it's very disheartening to make a physical playtest kit with hand-drawn maps, send it to somebody, and get no feedback. That is a level of work that is not sustainable. That's where the better computer tools have made it a lot easier, the entry level, and getting play testers who are willing to do a little bit of they want a physical game printed out, or if they want to play on Vassal, they just play it on Vassal. That's helpful. But I think having a different set at the after you've kind of laid in what you're comfortable with, and I would frankly, I would be uncomfortable if I hadn't played the game at least a dozen times or more. Now we'll break down different parts of the game or play through different. You don't necessarily have to play it end to end. Once you establish that it works end to end, you can focus on different parts and kind of focus on essentially like scenarios in there if there's sticky bits on the map or certain mechanics. So like I was playtesting Malplaquet. So it's kind of a weird piece, like it's the edge of the world at the map, but literally it was like the edge of the world because they just didn't want to go any farther. So they're like, this is as far as the map goes. Why? Because they didn't really want to go any farther, and neither side showed any interest of trying to outflank the other. They're like, nope, it's getting late. We're going through the center, so yeah, I'm late for tea. Fix bayonets. Let's do it. So how that works out on the edge of the map is making sure that how do you keep that to reflect the historical reality that they just weren't going to go any farther. Could they have? Yeah, but at some point they said, "All right, screw it, we're going in." How do you build that into the rules? That's a huge challenge too. Is what are the realistic constraints? That's why I like the orders systems because the orders play in there. You mentioned one where it's the unknown. That's a great mechanic of like I got an A, B, and C unit, but then you draw against or roll against that value. The A units are more likely to have a good value. C units are more likely to have bad value, but there's a distribution of value with the units that's unknown until they're in action, which is kind of you can build that in into various ways, but that's a unique way to kind of capture some of that. We don't know until they actually fight.
So Ben, I don't see any other questions. So on top, so on behalf of Georgetown University Wargaming Society, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I think it was great to have your expertise and your time, which we are very appreciative on a Tuesday evening. So once again, thank you. And thank you for our audience for joining us, and hopefully see you next time.